Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for the last lecture in this series this year. I am so appreciative for Professor Marlow Anderson joining us this evening. And I hear we have quite the alumni crowd from actually across the globe. So thank you all for tuning in. My name is Tiffany Kelly. I'm the Director of Alumni and Family Relations. And please stay tuned for other last lectures that we will have in this last few months of the of the semester. Marlow Anderson studied mathematics as an undergraduate at Whitman College, which is located in his hometown, Walla Walla, Washington. He went on to study abstract algebra at the University of Kansas, receiving his PhD in 1977. He began his academic career at Indiana Purdue at Fort Wayne before coming to Colorado College in 1982. In addition to technical papers as partially ordered algebra, he has co-written a technical monograph on lattice-ordered groups and an undergraduate textbook on abstract algebra, now in its third edition. In recent years, he has developed a strong interest in the history of mathematics and has co-edited 2 collections of papers on mathematical history with Robin Wilson of the Open University. Over the years, he has taught much of the undergraduate curriculum in mathematics at Colorado College, with particular emphasis on algebra, analysis, and mathematical history, including a number of courses in general education. In the classroom, he is well known for being lively, loud, and liable to spill coffee on students in the front row. In the late 90s, he took up scuba diving, which has taken him and his wife all over the world. That interest led him to write a book on the physics of scuba diving. Marlow has been married for over 30 years to his wife, Audrey. They live in a 19th century house in Manitou Springs, Colorado, with their 4 cats, all named after mathematicians. Marlow, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm really looking forward to giving this talk, and I'm very excited about the large audience out there, many of whom I know and some of whom I don't, but it's going to be fun, I think.
I also wanted to let everyone know that there will be time for questions at the end. We'll reserve the last 15 to 10 minutes for questions.
All right, shall I get started then?
Please.
Okay. I've given many lectures over many years, but this is an uncharacteristic one because I've never mentioned myself more than once a talk. And this is mostly about me and my adventure as a mathematician. I hope it'll be emblematic for the listeners about what a mathematician's career is like, especially within the liberal arts context. And you'll get a little fun and insight into the Colorado College and its math department. So let's get started. Maybe not. Okay, here I am. This is me pictured with my parents' adding machine when I'm like 2 years old in 1952. This was a staged photo by my dad, of course, but I loved calculating machines from the time I was very young. And indeed, about 10 years after this picture, my dad used to bring home this wonderful, enormous calculator that not only added and subtracted, but it multiplied and divided. And I was just absolutely fascinated by this machine, which was a very expensive piece of machinery at that time. And so my dad cautioned me not to jam the machine, not to get in the way of the movement of the registers. When you divided one number by another, this machine would make this lovely sound, clunk, 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 and then you would look up and see in the little metal wheels the recording of the result of the calculation. And of course, at that time, I was calculating things like 156 divided by 512, which was saying, if you go 6 for 12 and you're already batting 300, what's your batting average actually look like? So what was I interested in as a young proto-mathematician? A whole lot of things. But one thing was, I did all my homework. I was a good student, but I never brought anything home. My dad used to say, homework? I never saw Marlow do a single lick of homework. And that's because I got it all done at school because I had so many projects of my own to work on. One of my great interests was the founding fathers, and in particular, my American hero then and now, Benjamin Franklin. There I am dressed up to play Benjamin Franklin in a elementary school pageant. And I had the wonderful line, we must hang together, or surely we will all hang separately. Unfortunately, Franklin's career was so long that some other kid got to play Franklin during the Constitutional Convention. And so he got to say, what have you given us, Dr. Franklin? A republic, if you can keep it. Here I am on the very first day of class with my Roy Rogers lunchbox near my feet, with the Sansabelt belt, with the buttoned-up shirt, and with the what else? Oh, the lovely haircut my mother supplied. Here I am helping build my parents' home in Walla Walla, Washington, with my brother and my dad. We used to, as a family, drive up the Columbia Gorge every weekend to help build the house.
Marlow, can I just interrupt quickly? I'm so sorry. We can't see your presentation, and I know everyone wants to see your photos.
You can't see.
You can't see it.
Share. Can you see it now?
Now we can see it. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sorry. There I am as Benjamin Franklin. There I am, my first day at school, building the house, and there my favorite book of all time, the Merriam-Webster Unabridged Dictionary, which I poured into to draw family diagrams of Greek gods and goddesses and write down names of dinosaurs and all that sort of thing. I still own that book to this day. You can see the lunchback box there that I mentioned a little earlier. Okay, so now, let's look at this picture. This is Marlow as a fledgling instructor telling my brother something important. My brother had to put up a lot of what I call my pontificating, which generations of students are now used to hearing. And there I am telling him something important about something. Here you see my great moment on television. This was on local Portland television, where I was part of an elementary team, TV quiz team. And we actually won the contest over some other elementary school. That was just glory for us on the team, but we did win some books for our school, Whitaker School Library. Sadly, Whitaker burnt down a couple years later, and so I think this picture is the only surviving artifact of my great quiz team career. So, another thing I was deeply interested in was baseball, although I never saw a game except the World Series on black and white TV. But I loved baseball cards, and who couldn't love them? Look at all these numbers on the reverse. I was entranced by all the wonderful numbers involved in baseball. And 1961, when this card was issued, was really an important year because Mickey Mantle and his teammate Roger Maris were trying to break Babe Ruth's record of 60 home runs in a single season. And my brother followed that very, very closely, cut out articles out of the Portland newspapers. Again, even though we never saw any on television because we went to Walla Walla every weekend to build our house. It's sociologically very interesting that Mickey Mantle was a white guy, even though there were many great black players at that time. And indeed, if you'd asked me as a 10-year-old, who are your favorite outfielders? I would have said, well, Mickey Mantle, of course. But then I would have gone on and said, and Hank Aaron and Willie Mays and Frank Robinson and Roberto Clemente. And why? Because if you looked at the reverse of their cards, they were the best. I'm always been somebody interested in people who can do what they do very, very well. And Mantle and Mays and Aaron and so forth certainly fit that category. So I went to high school, and as you might guess, I was a pretty good student, especially in mathematics. I finally landed in Walla Walla full time because the house was close enough to done that we could live in it. And so I went to, as they call it, WAHI, the Walla Walla High School in Walla Walla, Washington. We had moved around an awful lot in the Pacific Northwest following my dad's jobs as a construction superintendent. And so interestingly, I was not placed in the highest level math class, which would have been calculus, because I probably lost some ground transferring from Beaverton to Salem to Portland and so forth. And so I was in a class surrounded by smart juniors, but I enjoyed the class. It is sadly interesting that I have absolutely no memory of what actually happened in the math class. What I mainly remember is that we had a discussion among some of my student friends before class, and I was, how shall we say it, pontificating about how I thought I was such a weird number, the square root of -1. Isn't it amazing to have a square root of -1? You have to invent such a weird number. And I furthermore said, just think what a really weird number it'll be when somebody invents the square root of I. And my little friend, Kathy Heacock, she took this to heart and went to her brother, who was already in college, and talked to him, and he found out what the square root of I was. And I was crushed because it wasn't some weird new number. It was just a complex number like this. And what follows now is the only proof in this talk. So if you're really interested in listening to proofs, this is it. So pay attention. What we do is we multiply it out. Now, my students all say, oh, shall we FOIL this out? That's not the language we used back in 1966. But if you do FOIL it out, you do indeed get I. And I was disappointed because I wanted something weird and new. I had some sort of idea that I didn't know really about something I didn't know really existed, about abstract algebra. Long after this event, I thought back and I thought, was Kathy flirting with me when she went through all this time and effort to figure out what the square root of I was? You may roll your eyes, but this was undoubtedly the only occasion I can think of, either at the time or later, when I might have actually been flirted with in high school. I was a nerd, as this picture represents. There I am in all my nerddom, and guess what? I'm with the two other smartest kids in high school at that time, merit scholars, after taking the appropriate exam. My friend Jim here, years and years later, I learned that after I had moved away from Walla Walla, he came out as gay and then moved off to San Francisco, got a nice job, and was an early victim of the AIDS plague. So all of his bright potential went to waste. Carrie Glover was my secret crush at the time, which of course I did not act on. Carrie went on to Harvard Law School, got a degree, got a job at a fancy law school in Seattle, and about 25 years later, Carrie was the chair of the board of trustees at Whitman College, where she and I went to college. So Carrie certainly made a good bit of it. Okay. So if you probably didn't notice, but on that clipping, it says Marlow plans to be an electrical engineer. This was not even remotely my idea. It was my dad's idea. And I moved to Pullman, Washington to go to Washington State University to study electrical engineering. I lived with my grandmother. This is me and my grandmother about 10 years earlier. And she used to rent rooms to Wazoo students. And so I, of course, would live with her. And that was great, except she got very ill. She had to move back with my parents. And I, 18 years old, was suddenly in charge of her house. I had to collect rent checks. I knew nothing about anything in the real world. And it was a very hard semester. And so by the time I got back to Walla Walla over the summer, I, of course, was not going to go back to WSU because my grandmother's house would be sold. And it turned out I was going to become a townie. I was going to go to Whitman College because I did have that scholarship money. So I was able to go to Whitman and study mathematics, because this whole business of engineering went away, thank goodness. And here is a photograph from my college yearbook of the hard science faculty at Whitman College in that time, 1971 or so, 1967 or something like that. And you will notice there was only a single woman faculty member in the sciences. The biologists aren't depicted, but they weren't, none of them were women either. Kind of amazing. My mathematician instructors were the lovely old Dr. Hutchings, who taught me a 1930s style geometry class, Doug Underwood, who taught me abstract algebra out of a very stiff book. I looked later, maybe I'll use that book at Colorado College. And I said, oh my God, this book is too hard for mere undergraduates. But that's what we took abstract algebra was back in the day. Dr. Anderson taught me a wonderful seminar course in general topology, which became a great love of mine. At that time, I thought it was just algebra because it was intersections and unions of sets. Dr. Thomason here taught me all the applied stuff. I took it all. I took every course that they offered in math. So probability, statistics, PDEs, numerical analysis, Fortran programming. I hated every minute of it, all that applied stuff, but I took it because it was called math. So anyway, a very interesting person in this picture is right here. His name is Walter Brattain, and he is one of the three guys who won a Nobel Prize for inventing the transistor back in the day at Bell Labs. I never got to know him very well, but he did have a great seminar on the history of science and philosophy of science when he brought in a friend of his to help teach that. And incidentally, Walter Brattain was a much better person than William Shockley, the infamous inventor of the transistor, who went off into eugenics and all sorts of unpleasant stuff. So anyway, here is my 1954 Chevy loaded to go to graduate school. I ended up going to Lawrence, Kansas. I applied to several schools. I applied to MIT because I wanted to be close to Noam Chomsky and his very, very abstract linguistics and his very, very left-wing politics. They didn't even admit me. I applied to Berkeley. I really wanted to be where the free speech movement started and all the anti-war demonstrations were. They admitted me, but they didn't give me any money. But Dr. Underwood had said, you should apply to University of Kansas, because we had a student named Pete Pennick. He got in, he got money, and he seems to be doing very well. So in the end, that's where I ended up going, because they gave me a 4-year university fellowship to go to the University of Kansas. And there is the famous 54 Chevy, all loaded. This is probably the afternoon before I left on that long, long journey in the 54 Chev. I still own the 54 Chev, and it has recently been restored in pristine, beautiful condition. After I got to Kansas, here's a picture that was probably taken that first year, and you gotta love this picture. Look at the pocket protectors in both Pete's pocket and mine. Look at the hair, look at the shirts. This is classic. John Leibman here was actually a better friend. Both John and Pete left after master's degrees. Pete went off to teach in secondary education. And John, kind of by accident, ended up with jobs close to me, both in Walla Walla originally and then later in the Denver area. He died very prematurely, sadly. Here I am in graduate school with my graduate school mentor, Steve Carlson. That's this gentleman right here. Steve was a little bit older than I. He had done undergraduate work at KU. He spent 3 years in the Army, and then he came back to graduate school, and he knew everything about how the real world worked and how KU worked, and I relied on him very closely. And indeed, he provided me with the 2 most important skills for surviving graduate school: drinking beer and playing pinball. I owe to Steve. The woman there in the middle is named Kathy Gates. Kathy was at that time, I do believe, or shortly thereafter, the only woman PhD student at Kansas. And I thought she was a little stuck up and reserved, but she carried a very heavy load, being a woman in a man's world, as it were. Things, of course, changed radically in the next 20 years. But at that point, the only women in graduate school at KU were pursuing just graduate master's degrees to go into teaching or something. Here's another picture from that general time, and these 2 people here, some of you out there might recognize. This is John Watkins, who got his degree at KU, and his wife Laurel, who were faculties at Colorado College for many, many years. And indeed, I owe to John my movement to KU later. There's Steve Carlson again. Vincie Fawn was seduced away by from the mathematics department to economics. She's now like a professor of economics at Georgetown. And this is my roommate and friend, Dave Lance. My colleague Ike Agbenouzi may know him or remember him as the person who hired him when Ike took his job at Colgate before he came to Colorado College. So the important thing then was to choose an academic advisor. And Steve, of course, gave me advice. And his big advice, which I always give to graduate students, prospective graduate students, is you pick the person instead of the field. You pick a person who's going to treat you fairly, be interested in your progress. And that was Paul to a T, a great mathematician and a great man to work with. He warned me that I'd be a little bit out in left field in abstract algebra. His discipline of last order groups was a little bit unusual, but he also told me when he took a student, he did not consider his job complete until he got his degree and he got tenured somewhere. And Paul eventually was able to succeed in doing that. This picture was actually taken a year or two later after I had got my first real job, when I was a co-sponsor of a special session at the general mathematics, the joint mathematics meetings. This is a more typical picture of a party at Dave Lance and my strange barn of an apartment. Graduate school, if you've got an assistantship, you got enough money to buy beer and pizza, and then you're set because you've got mathematics to live after. So here are the first 2 pages of my first published paper in 1977. And this is a lovely paper to remember because it has not 1, not 2, but 14 conditions on what's called an Archimedean lattice ordered group. And there was only one theorem in the paper, and the theorem said the following 9 statements are equivalent, and they all imply the last 5, which are also equivalent. And I thought this was an interesting structure for a paper. I knew Paul liked that structure because I saw him do it in classes, but little did I know at the time that this was part of a tradition from Paul's academic advisor, whom I never met, unfortunately, Reinhold Baer here, a very famous group theorist and algebraist. Baer had an interesting story being the generation he was in. He went to Göttingen in the 1920s, got his PhD very rapidly from a student of David Hilbert, who was still a very active part of that school in the 1920s. He went off and got a good job in what eventually became East Germany, and he seemed set, except in the mid-30s, he was told that his services were no longer required because his parents were Jewish. Reinhold evidently was not himself a religious person, but that really didn't matter, of course, in that time period. Reinhold was enough of a star that he was able to he was invited over to England, spent a year at Lancaster, and then went to Oxford for a while, ended up at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton for a while, and finally, after the end of the war, got a job teaching as a full professor at the University of Illinois, which is where he encountered my advisor, Paul Conrad. So I like that my first academic paper harkens back to a tradition from someone as famous and important in algebra as Reinhold Baer. So I came out on the job market in 1978, and guess what? Lots of candidates, hardly any jobs. It was a very tough year. And so I managed to get an interview at Indiana Purdue at Fort Wayne, a branch campus of both the University of Indiana and Purdue University. These days, it's only affiliated with Purdue. I was offered a 3-year job, and I took it. Later, it turned out the HR department says, says to the chair of the department, we don't have 3-year jobs. You're going to have to convert him to a tenure track job. And so that's how I ended up with a tenure track job because of a bureaucratic glitch. Now, at that time, I was very, very interested in the ring functions on a topological space X, what's called C of X for short. And Paul, my advisor, recommended when you give your interview talk about C of X, because everybody can kind of react to that a little bit and understand a little bit about what's going on. And so I did. And the chair of the department, Maynard Mansfield, says, I didn't know anybody did C of X anymore. And he says, do you know this book, Gilman and Jarrison? And I said, of course I know Gilman and Jarrison. There is the beloved Gilman and Jarrison itself. I had studied that book and referred to that book very closely. And it turned out that Maynard Mansfield was a graduate student who took notes from the 3 guys actually writing the book, Gilman, Jarrison, and Hendrickson. And so it was, general topology is of practical value after all. It got me my first academic job. Melvin Hendrickson, I later saw quite a bit of because he both wrote some papers in the general area of lattice ordered groups, and he was also a professor at Harvey Mudd College, one of the Claremont undergraduate liberal arts colleges. Harvey Mudd is very much a STEM school, but at any rate. And so Mel, when I would see him at meetings, he would always come up to me and he would screw up his face. He was a short, burly guy. And he says, do you guys still have that block plan? I mean, he was the contempt was dripping from him. And I said, yeah, of course, it works well. Well, Mel was never convinced about that, but he was convinced about the value of rings of continuous function. My friend and professor at Kansas, Jack Porter, always called rings of continuous functions the New Testament for general topologists. So I moved to Fort Wayne. Here's a couple pictures of me from Fort Wayne. My good friend Mark Lipman, his wife Claudia, whom you can hardly see, another colleague named C.C. Edwards. I wrote a paper of graph theory, not a very good paper, with Mark. I wrote a couple papers about semigroups with C.C. in that 4 years that I was at Indiana Purdue at Fort Wayne. Here is a picture of my great buddies from Fort Wayne. There I am. And guess what? I'm dressed to kill because I'm about to get married to the love of my life, Audrey Anderson, Audrey Swales then. And there's my friend Mark Merriman, David Legg, and Reese Price Jones, who was an English graph theorist. Oh, I said it wrong. A Welsh graph theorist who arrived at Indiana Purdue the same time I did. And no, Audrey did not marry her professor, but I was auditing Reese's class in graph theory when I first met Audrey there. She was a student of Reese's. Here's a picture taken just right after I moved to CC, but it's Fort Wayne relevant. There's Reese again. To the far right, you see Lowell Beinecke. Lowell Beinecke was and is a very eminent and important graph theorist. And so IPFW, which was kind of a commuter school, had a great research program in graph theory. And standing next to him is Lowell's friend and co-author, Robin Wilson from Great Britain. And that began a lifelong friendship between Audrey and myself with Robin back in the old days when he visited CC very, very often, taught a lot of blocks at CC. Audrey and Robin and I, sometimes in the company of some of Robin's students, took mad dash 5-day trips to visit every spectacular tourist spot in the west, in the Mountain West, Arches and Canyonlands and all those wonderful places. And we had lots of great adventures doing that. So how did I end up at CC? I ran into John Watkins. There he is. This is actually a couple years later than what I'm actually talking about. John ran into me and we promptly went into a bar, and he complained about a hiring decision that had gone south where a non-tenure track person had his contract not renewed, and John was really annoyed about it. This was not a good recruiting tool, you'd think, but then John went on ahead and said, hey, and we have a tenure track position and you should apply for it. And I did. I also applied at Oklahoma State, and Audrey was saying, please, Colorado, not Oklahoma, not Oklahoma. And it worked out wonderfully well. At that meeting, I actually met my great friend and colleague, Fred Tinsley. Dave Rader was the chair of the department then, and we seemed to spend hours on the phone. That was when long distance cost money, talking about baseball, about jazz, and occasionally about CC too. But it turned out to be a great soft sell recruiting effort, and I took the job. That first year, let's see how we're doing for time. Robin spent a whole semester there. He brought along his friend, a famous graph theorist named Frank Harari, who was actually Lowell Beinecke's dissertation supervisor. Frank mentioned a problem in finite group theory in a seminar talk, and I latched onto that, figured out some solutions to Frank's problems, went to Frank, and he says, oh, write that up. We have a paper now. This is how you write 800 papers, is you get other people to write the paper. But of course, the crucial ideas were Frank's, to be fair. And that meant that I wrote a paper with Harari, and Harari wrote a paper with Paul Erdős, and that meant my Erdős number became 2. Actually, I'd already had an Erdős number of 3, although I didn't know it at that time. So I went on to a lot of math conferences, and I just want to mention this one briefly here. There I am. There's my advisor, Paul Conrad. There's Mel Hendrickson himself, the famous third author of Gilman and Jarrison. Hendrickson left Purdue a little too early to have his name on the book. And my colleague and friend, George Martinez, who organized this meeting in Curacao. And somehow or other in Curacao, Audrey tried out scuba diving for the first time. She was actually crushed because the guy who had a little shack on the beach promised her a second scuba dive a couple days later, and he did not keep that promise because he just had something else to do, and Audrey was crushed. But here is Audrey years later communing with her favorite creature, the manta. And years later, I actually wrote a book about the physics of scuba diving, trying to actually explain where these numbers on this proprietary dive chart actually come from, because I was very frustrated with the literature out there, which didn't really explain the math enough for me. And there's the book. But that was not my first book. My first book was with my good friend and colleague, Todd File, who spent a couple of years at Kansas. And I am amazed that in just 18 months or so, Todd and I became lifelong friends, of course, based on beer and pinball and lattice ordered groups. We made a great team because he knew the Holland non-commutative school of lattice order groups, and I knew the Conrad, not necessarily abelian, but more abelian than the Holland stuff. And there is that first book that appeared in the late 1980s when I was a new young professor at CC. Todd was sharing my office here because he was on sabbatical for a semester at CC. Todd and I later wrote an abstract algebra textbook aimed at liberal arts colleges, and it's appeared in 1, 2, 3 editions over the years. It takes the unusual rings first approach opposed to groups, which we always thought was pedagogically more sound because you have more examples to work with. Anyway, once I became a professor at Colorado College, I had lots of things to do. One of them is hiring. It seems like we've been hiring every year for 30 years. This happens to be Stephen Janke and Jane McDougall getting ready to meet yet another crop of young mathematicians. I always enjoyed interviewing young mathematicians at the meetings, but we did more hiring than anybody should do. We did more hiring than any liberal arts college that I ever knew. We did more hiring than any other department at Colorado College did because we were chronically understaffed. At any rate, I took this picture. It was probably illegal because I was violating some HIPAA requirements regarding privacy by even taking this picture. At the same meeting, there's Robin Wilson and I with Victor Katz. We co-edited a great little collection of historical papers from the Mathematical Association of America journals. And actually, there was a second volume that came out later, and there's the second volume. There were lots of special events happening at Colorado College, especially in those earlier years. This was a great meeting that John Watkins arranged about algorithms, featuring lectures by a famous mathematician named Herb Wilf right there in the corner. You see a couple of my IPFW colleagues. There's Kathy Merrill and Dave Rader and Richard Koo, a very eminent alumnus of our college. John Watkins also. Very nice group. Laura Rogers taught at UCCS for many years. And here is a Robin Wilson extravaganza. Robin knows an awful lot about the mathematics of Charles Dodgson, aka Lewis Carroll, and he wrote a script melding the characters from the Alice stories with his mathematical career. And this was given as a dramatic reading, as it were. We all had, there I am as Mock Turtle, there's Robin. And Robin managed to talk the president of the college at the time, Catherine Mormon, to play the one-line part of Queen Victoria, which we thought was hilarious. Queen Victoria evidently had told her folks, next time Professor Dodgson publishes a book, I want to be sure and have a copy. And sure enough, his next book was not an Alice book. It was a book about mathematics. And the line, which may or not be really accurate, was, "We are not amused." You will see some famous CC professors in this picture. Werner Heim of biology, Ruth Barton of English, Ted Lindemann of chemistry, in addition to some mathematicians as well, Gowrie Maida and Jane McDougall. That's Robin's wife there. And this is our famous Carol Mills, who was our staff assistant for many, many years. We also had a very nice little conference about math history. There's my young colleague, Mike Sidaway, and his good friend, Reinhard Lavenbacher. And of course, Robin is going to be there because Robin had and has a deep interest in the history of mathematics. And that's Gauss, a little bit overexposed in the rear, but a famous emblem that appears to this day in the math department. A little bit later, Mike Sidaway nominated me for the Burton Jones Teaching Award from the Rocky Mountain section of the MAA. I won that award, and then I had to give a talk. And there I am giving my talk about the history of the cycloid at a local MAA meeting. We also dedicated a classroom that we hung on to in Palmer Hall taught by Florian Cajori, who was a classic and important figure in the history of the college. He figures as an important player in the infamous Slocum story, which you can read about elsewhere. You'll notice John Watkins and Andrea Bruder and me and Janet Barnett of the University of Southern Colorado in Pueblo. There is the actual plaques you can see if you will go into Palmer Hall. Here is Stephen for other kinds of events. This is Stephen Janke's 50th birthday. How time passes. You can see my wife Audrey, Kathy Merrill, Debbie Levinson, Jane McDougall, Gowrie Mehta. This is Barry Bailoff, who was a paraprofessional in our department at that time and is now a professor of mathematics at Whitman. Just recently, relatively recently, we had a LEIBNIZ Fest. This is thanks to Beth Malmstog, knowing that I claimed fervently that I am a card-carrying Leibnizian, which means I love Leibniz calculus notation to the exclusion of all others, and claimed I was a card-carrying member of the Leibniz Society. And Beth said, "You need to actually have cards." Whoops, I thought I had a card here. There it is. There's my actual card-carrying Leibnizian. This is Michael Kim, who gave a little talk about Leibniz from the philosophical point of view. One thing I did for the college, for the department, was to invent the Fearless Friday seminar series. I couldn't believe there wasn't a seminar series for the math department, and I said, we just have to do that. And that, in those days, was an outreach to the faculty. I thought we really needed a couple hours per week when we actually were not thinking about teaching, thinking about 8 blocks out of 9, but instead we're thinking about mathematics. And so an hour of a talk and then an hour buying the speaker a drink, and that established a tradition that has persisted. We have more recently included regularly talks aimed at students, but it was originally to help the faculty survive in heavy teaching loads and thinking about mathematics. That's my colleague, Kathy Merrill, talking about wavelets. And there's the other half of the equation, David Brown, Stephen Janke, Jane McDougall, and Fred out for drinks. Here's Molly and I taking out Robin for a great talk he gave on Euler. And Stefan Erickson, my colleague and friend, he established a tradition where he would always give the last talk of the year, and he would also host a party immediately thereafter. And he somehow survived doing that. You see John Watkins, Amelia Taylor. This is Courtney Givens, who was at that time a paraprofessional and has since become a professor of mathematics at Hamilton College. Okay, this is more recent, a Fearless Friday from a couple years ago, and the speaker was Corey Scott, and I am so pleased to announce that we have just hired Corey tenure track as a professor of computer science at Colorado College. We also regularly would go out for an end of the block lunch on the fourth Friday. I'm sort of whipping through a lot of this at the time because I'm running out of time, but you can see Carol Mills, our staff assistant, Jonathan Braden, the first hire with a PhD in computer science at Colorado College. There's Dave Rader, Jane, Stephen, and so forth. Here's a couple other Fearless Friday occasions. There's Mike Sidaway with his friend and co-author David Brown. There's me. And there, I don't for the life of me remember or understand why we had all these clown masks, but there's Dave and the junior women members of the department at that time. And they were referred to as Dave and the Bozos. It sounds a bit sexist now. That's just the way we talked about it then. This is what we are reduced to for our fourth Friday luncheon, which is a Zoom meeting with no lunch, no drinks, but still some good fellowship and a nice occasion, not to be confused with what we will have again when we get out from under the COVID crisis. I want to slap up a few pictures of favorite students. This is Amy Hepner, who will tell you, I'm Marlow's favorite student, and that's pretty close to the truth. There I am working with Courtney when she was an undergraduate. She established a tradition that will never be broken. She and I worked on general topology all day, morning and afternoon in the math lounge. And one day I looked up and Courtney had fallen asleep. This is the only time my entire class has fallen asleep during a block. Danny Richardson was a student who started in pre-calc but ended up finishing the math major. There's Barry Bailoff again. Here are a couple of my thesis students. Allie wrote a really interesting thesis about the fractal nature of cities. Bainey did work on the complex automorphisms of the complex field, which my student Elizabeth Wolf is carrying on now. For a while, we had nothing but set games in the lounge. There's Courtney and another favorite student, Ariel Detlefsen, and there's Jet Henderson. And we even took our geometry class to the local coffee shop owned at that time by friends of mine. There's Malcolm Gabbard, one of my recent thesis students. I still like him, even though he agreed to go to graduate school at K-State, for God's sakes. This is a more recent, very charming group of important students. Haley Colgate, Sam Kotler, Edgar Santos Vega, Sophie Aiken, and Abigail Ezel, who's still a student. Edgar gave a very fine poster presentation at the MAA meeting at which this was, and Sophie and Sam were our paraprofessionals at the point that picture was taken. Here's a couple grads. Molly is now a professor at Colorado College. Sarah is now a professor at Denison University, and they are trying to keep the tradition of taking Marlow out for beers at national math meetings now that all my colleagues are retired or deceased. And there's a great student who ended up studying statistics, Minky Liu, that I saw at the Seattle math meetings. There's yet another thesis student, Ellen Silk. Here is a happy group of graduates from a couple years ago, featuring Hanson Smith, who's now a number theorist, and Rosie Kurtz, who is doing great work as a high school teacher in Dallas, Texas, and is really gets people registered to vote. Great person. There are paraprofessionals galore: Andrew Bean, Corey Scott, and Evan Rankin. Another of my favorite students, Kayla Ryan, who wrote a great thesis with me about integration theory. And we faced a lot of complicated issues with her during her undergraduate career, but she is now prospering as a physical therapist in the Boston area. There are the famous 4 silverback males. This is at Fred's retirement, Fred and Stephen and John and I. And in this picture, Stephen and John were already retired, and I'm just about there. So that school of mathematicians, all hired by Dave Rader, who made a profound impact on the department. We're out of here. We had a couple great retreats at the Garden of the Gods Club. And here's a couple pictures of those meetings over a couple years. And you can see some of our younger faculty, Beth Malmskog and Flavia and Stefan and Matthew and Janet Burge and Molly. So great group, great group. And this is a more recent Christmas picture. I have a lot of these group Christmas pictures through the years. Andrew Kelly, our new hire in computer science, not our newest now, Dan Ellsworth, and Nguyen Nguyen, Kirsten Hoganson, who did a great job for us in graph theory for a couple years, and some of the old guys too. But of course, the most important picture in the presentation, which is the last picture in my presentation, is my cats. Audrey's and my cats. I should hasten to add, all of our cats are named after mathematicians. This is Hardy after G.H. Hardy, Pascal after Blaise Pascal, Euclid after Euclid, and Blaise after Blaise Pascal. We have two cats named after one mathematician for complicated reasons I need not go into. So I hope that's been interesting. It's running a little long, but I think we might have time for a question or two if there are any, and I can figure out where they are. Okay, let's see. Yes, Courtney asked, in your career, how many times has the entire class fallen asleep? One and only one time. Thank you, Courtney, for that. And Rosemary Kurtz says, Marlow, join DSA. And what is DSA? I threw it right back at you. The Democratic Socialists of America. Yes, back in the day, I was in that place at WSU. I was a member of the SDS chapter at WSU. Of course, as I found out later when we went for a visit to University of Washington, that was kind of like moderate liberal Democrats as compared to the Maoists that I met in the University of Washington. Okay. There will be a recording, and I'm not sure under exactly what circumstances it will be shared, but I will let people know. Molly Moran, my colleague, asked if I ever considered studying statistics because of baseball. You'd think so, but I never did. When I took statistics at Whitman, I really didn't like it very much. Okay. All right. Sarah says, good thing your two-person abstract algebra class never fell asleep. That is correct. Sarah was half of an abstract algebra class, part 2, incidentally. There is Ilana Steinberg, whom I have not seen for a long, long time. It's great to see your name. Brianna Sally, this is great. You can't use... Well, I think maybe you can still use my CC email because I think I still use it for Stephen and John. Ike says, what's the worst advice I ever got? Oh my God. Things worked out so well, I have a hard time to imagine what that would have been. Changes in technology, somebody, Jeannie Workelshouse asked, did that make teaching harder or easier? For sure, harder to engage. I am struggling teaching via Zoom. I like a lot of aspects about Zoom, but I'm not that happy about the personal connection. Amelia Taylor asks, what about the time you were co-teaching and your co-teacher showed up with a broken arm and other injuries? Yes, Amelia had a issue with her bike, and all of a sudden she went from the most energetic person in the room to maybe not so much. She was bunged up pretty bad. Tom Southall, the football player back when Colorado College Hat Football says, I believe I was in your first class, Calc 1 in 1982. That is very too cool. And he says, it must have been my enthusiasm for the subject for him to take Calc 2 after Calc 1. That's a compliment. I'd love to hear that from you, Tom. Okay. What would have happened if I had gone to Oklahoma State instead of CC, asked Dale Orth? It would have been a disaster, because when I was interviewing Oklahoma State, my friend there, a Lattisorted Groups person, was saying, oh my God, we have so much money. The legislature is giving us so much money. We have big salaries. We have lots of travel money and all that. And then I ran into him a year later, and he says, oh, that all dried up with the oil crisis. And so it would not have been a happy place. So I'm doubly happy. I was very happy at CC throughout my entire career, and so I'm doubly happy that I picked that. Okay. What is the most exciting thing that has been proven across all of math during your years as a mathematician? I just don't think there's any doubt. To me, it's Fermat's last theorem. And that was such an exciting ongoing story because it was proved. Then there was a hole, and then Andrew Wiles discovered a way to fill that with a graduate student of his named Taylor. It was all a very exciting time, and a great classically important problem. Andrea asks, what was the biggest class at CC that you've taught? Thank goodness, 32 is as big as I ever got, because that was the limit when I taught 2 at a time. I have regularly stretched calculus classes to 28, 29, maybe 30, but officially the limit is 25. What in math interests you after you retire? Asked my good friend Kaylin Sievert. Almost all of it. I look forward to being able to poke through the MAA journals and read some really good stuff. Somebody asks if I have this little jar that's labeled bad students on my table. I do, but it just has paper clips in it. I don't seem to be able to fit my bad students, of which there aren't many at all, into that little jar. Rosie asks if Anderson Claus will still make an appearance at Christmas. I think someone else needs to take over as Anderson Claus. Helen Daly, philosopher, asks, where are you going scuba diving next? And we are going with Ken Curtis out there somewhere into the Pacific side of Mexico. Amy Hepner asks, what's your favorite class to teach? Math history, abstract algebra 1 for sure. And of course, any course you're in, Amy. Evan Rankin says, did someone still make cool posters for the Fearless Friday talks? And he says, Kayla Ryan has also contributed to this question. Unfortunately, since we're all remote, we don't really have the posters that we have put up that Evan had his hand in making. That's kind of sad. Socorro, my friend Ken Curtis filled my lapse there in memory when I was talking about where I'm diving next. Sophie Aiken, advice for grad students, learn from the older grad students. They know what's really happening. And I think the advice I mentioned earlier is also really good. Pick the person more than the field if you're looking for a dissertation supervisor. Where's Audrey? asked our good friend Dave Mills, who was married to our wonderful staff assistant, Carol Mills. And Audrey is at Karen and Kaylin's house right now. Robin Wilson asked me, what's your favorite block break trip? And oh my God, it is hard to imagine. It wasn't the one when we took your daughter out into the desert and we had not one but two flat tires. It was probably Arches, I think, would be the one I'd say. I ask if we can entice you to tour the country, visiting your former students and giving lectures. I might be willing to do a lecture or three if somebody was kind enough to offer. Is there any area of math you wish you had explored more in your career? I really think that algebraic geometry is that. I kind of knew about it. I knew a tiny bit about it, but I didn't really ever study it, and I regret that. My good friend Tom Culp asks, what about super primes? Tom has been talking to me for super primes for years. A super prime is a prime like 29, which is prime, but if you add the digits 2 and 9, you get 11, and that's also prime. And oh my God, if you add those two digits, 1 plus 1 is 2, that's also prime. Tom wants to know how many of these are there? Are there infinitely many? How many consecutive super primes can you find? As I did, I gave you a string of 3. From my wife, Audrey, will we continue to name cats after mathematicians? I think so. That's what I would say. Okay. Great or funny stories about John, Stephen, or Fred, asked Sharon Moulton, who was class of 79. John and Fred and I have a disagreement about that first meeting when I met Fred and saw John again, and John tried to recruit me, and in fact successfully recruited me to apply to CC. We have a disagreement. I say I was walking in Atlanta and I looked into a window at Woolworths and I saw Fred and John having breakfast at the Woolworths counter. John can hardly stand the idea that he had ever actually eaten at Woolworths. John has very sophisticated tastes, and he claims I was in Woolworths. We disagree about that all the time. Fred and I, Fred was on the faculty executive committee, a very important committee at Colorado College, for several times. And in the meetings were on Tuesday afternoon, and these were 2 till infinity. And Fred was frustrated by these meetings, as anyone was who was on that committee. I was later on that committee. And so we adopted a code in the department after Fred got off the committee, which was, so Fred, is it Tuesday today? And that meant, are you ready to go for a beer? Which Fred definitely was on most Tuesday afternoons, sitting in these very long, admittedly very important meetings. Are you planning to get another mathematical cat in the future? That was Audrey's question. We discovered that we have to have 4 cats. And so periodically we have to get another cat. And I expected the cat will probably be named after a mathematician. Andrea Bruder points out that there was a magical course involving 2 sections melded into one, in which she and I had 42 students. So that is the record number of students I had. Officially, only half of them were in my class, but effectively, in terms of office hours and so forth, it was a body of one. Any advice, Courtney says, any advice for your students who are now faculty? Have fun. Don't take campus politics too seriously. You can get very, very involved and very upset about campus politics issues, and somehow or other, the significance eludes one 5 years later. So that's my big advice. Okay, on that score, at least. I think it says no more open questions. It's 10 after 5. Tiffany, are we approaching an end here, do you think?
I think we are. Thank you so much. That was great. I'm glad that everyone was able to, looks like everybody was able to linger. Someone says time for a beer.
Yes.
Thanks everyone again for joining us, and stay tuned for other lectures that we have in this series.
All right.
And Marlow, thank you. And I hope that I get to actually meet you in person.
Yes, definitely. Until today, we hadn't even met on Zoom, although I'd exchanged a lot of emails with you. And likewise with Nicole and Christy and Dawn, who have all been very helpful in terms of the logistics of this talk.
That's right. Thank you to Christy, Nicole, and Dawn. And thank you to all of you alumni who joined us this evening. Have a great evening, everyone. Take care.